All right, we might get started. It's just hit across 2 o'clock. I hope everyone can hear me. My name's Gerard Brody. I'm the Chair of Consumers Federation of Australia, and I'd like to welcome you to our second webinar for the year. And with me, you can also see Georgia Mitchell. Georgia can wave as well. And so we will be presenting this webinar for you about our trip to Portugal, a bit like a slideshow, for the Consumers International Summit Conference of 2019. Before getting started, I just wanted to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the various places on which we meet and pay respects to elders past and present. So the way this webinar will work, we've got some slides that we will run through. I'll kick off, give a bit of a background around Consumers International and the summit, and then speak about some of the themes that came up, and then I'll hand over to Georgia, who was, sorry, Gemma, Georgia's sitting next to me. Gemma, I'm looking at the wrong thing. Who will speak in a bit more depth about some of the particular themes that came out at the summit. And we'll also, towards the end, speak a little bit about some of the particular member day topics as well, which we'll both speak about, and some of the side events. How do I move the slides? Try. Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. Well, so we thought we first, for those that are uninitiated, do a bit of a background about what is Consumers International. So Consumers International is the membership organisation for consumer groups around the world. It was founded in 1960 and has over 250 member organisations from 120 countries. Its head office is based in London, but it does have a presence in many of the regions around the world. The next slide. So this event was its summit, so that every 4 years the Consumers International holds a summit. And Gemma and I, along with a number of other consumer reps from Australia, were able to attend. So they included from the Consumers Federation, Ian Jarrett also attended, and he presented a side event, which Gemma will speak about in a little bit. Choice, who is also obviously a full member of the Consumers International, were there. Alan Kirkland, Emma, Erin Turner, and Sarah Agar. And there was also some representatives from the Consumer Policy Research, Lauren Solomon and Bridget Richmond. So it was a good contingent of Australians there. It was held at Estoril, which is just outside Lisbon in Portugal, a sort of beautiful, a very wealthy sort of area on the beachfront next to a casino of all places. I must admit I didn't darken the casino's door, but I'm not sure if others did. But it was a large conference centre there. There were 450 people attending the conference. It was sort of a 4-day event. One first day was side events, then a couple of days at the conference, and then a members only day. And the conference days itself had not only consumer representatives, but representatives from government agencies, from business, from other sorts of civil society organisations. I believe there was over 90 countries represented. That is a lovely photo of Lisbon when I went travelling. I thought that was my best shot, so I put that up there of the tram or funicular going up the street, looking out onto the ocean in Lisbon. But just to cover there the themes we're going to cover, I won't go through all in detail at the moment. We'll get to them and you can read them, and then we'll talk, as I mentioned, about some of the Members Day topics. And also on the final day as well was what the Consumers International have as their General Assembly, so members coming together to elect the representatives and governance of the organisation. The theme of the conference, though, was really digital innovation and living online. The sort of conference was around a space they called the Digital Hive, where there was various booths with information about businesses that were working in this area and looking to the future of consumer protection. I think this topic was chosen particularly because it influences us all wherever we are across the world. A lot of consumer protection issues can be very domestic focused, but digital issues are really affecting consumers in every country in the world, even those where their access to the internet mightn't be as great as it is. For example, in Australia, still digital innovation is having a significant impact. So one of the first sessions that I wanted to talk about was one around consumer advocacy in this new digital environment. And it was, as I said there, noted that half the world's population is now online and that technology is fundamentally changing the systems we rely on. And I think we all know that from our own experiences about any sort of engagement with service. The first thing we do is Google, we want to complain, we go to social media pages. And one of the debates in this discussion was about whether or not regulation is able to keep up with the changing market environment. There was a lot of discussion about the limits of regulations, although some said we shouldn't accept that as a premise and that regulation is the basis for the organisation of society and markets. Others felt that you need to look at different ways to hold businesses accountable rather than regulation. So, for example, EU were working with directly with businesses and particularly the platforms, the online platforms, to get them to undertake pledges about what they would do, and they were using that as an accountability mechanism. One of the presentations in this session was led by the CEO of Consumer Reports USA, Maria Toledo, and I thought what she had to say was interesting. It's to acknowledge in this digital world, choice is not transparent, and that more and more companies, particularly the Google, Facebook, and the like, Amazon, have really large market power, and they're effectively controlling not only prices but also the experience of our lives. And she sort of posited that issues are not transparent to consumers about the issues that affect us. And she put a challenge out for consumer groups, particularly those that are doing testing, to get smarter about the way in which, the way they test software, the way they inform the community about data security, privacy, and control. One of the other parts of this session was the presentations from industry, and this was an area of a bit of a debate throughout the conference. There was Vodafone, I think, were the ones that presented, and they argued that they are partners in the marketplace. They said that they're in particular a challenger business, often going to markets challenging incumbent telecommunication providers, and so they depend on choice working. And so there's a lot of focus about consumer groups working directly with business to get better outcomes, rather than, as I said, relying on regulation. But as I said, I don't think that was probably a complete view. Not everyone agreed, and others felt that the role of the consumer organisations is to be market watchdogs, to make companies accountable for their wrongdoing through various sorts of enforcement, and that there was a debate also about the risk of capture if dialogues were directly happening with market players. But in essence, I think most people can see there is benefit of doing both, talking directly to the industry, but also relying on sort of traditional tools. One of the discussions here was around things that the EU against Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, and the discussion about how that there is sort of a hesitancy to rely on those sort of market-wide frameworks that should ensure fair practices, and regulators not using it because they're concerned about using it in an inconsistent way, which I thought was interesting. But the argument was that we should encourage use of those sort of directives and avoid sector-specific regulation. So in that way, it could benefit both consumers and industry. And I should say that we are happy to answer, happy to ask questions. And there's a chat box there, and Georgia, who's with me here, is monitoring that and will let me know if there's questions that are coming up. The second key theme I wanted to mention was around sustainability. There wasn't probably a direct session on this topic, but it was something that was across many of the sessions often raised. One of the key positions was that we as consumers all need to radically change our lifestyles if we're going to save the world, really, and that we can't. There was sort of acknowledging that there previously had been a tension between consumption, which is what consumer advocates generally focus on, and sustainability, which is what environmental advocates have focused on. And the argument put was, well, they shouldn't be two different things. And we should be talking about sustainable consumption, and we should not be casting sustainability as a choice. It should be a given. There was some interesting points around digital innovation can actually help with sustainability. So Internet of Things technology can help achieve sustainable development goals. And I'll talk a bit about Internet of Things later on as well. And importantly, the role of consumer advocates is not just raising awareness and telling people about sustainable choices, but pushing policy and business to change to deliver sustainability while ensuring fairness and safety. The next one I wanted to talk about was around affordability and particularly access to communication services and online services, internet. The point was made that no country has achieved universal equitable access to the internet. There was put that affordability, when it's measured as that access to 1 gigabyte of data should not cost more than 2% of the average income in that country, that at the moment 24 countries don't reach that threshold. So that for those countries, it's actually even worse. And also a recognition that how important this is, because connectivity, and particularly mobiles, is essential for people's lives. Particularly the gig economy and work using access to these tools is so pervasive. If you want to be an Uber driver or whoever is in the gig economy, you need access to your phone. So the importance of affordability. And so some of the examples we heard about were some countries removing data caps that limit access. There was also discussion, particularly in the developing countries, about the investment in infrastructure that's needed to support these services, the need for devices that are affordable, and the need for broadband that's competitive. And I thought the relevance that I took away from that was here in Australia, we've also got ACAN, amongst others, pushing an affordable NBN campaign, and that was really that's really important. There was some discussion in these sections about literacy and digital skills and know-how. One of the points that struck me was the fact that the web is so based in English. Most of the web is actually in English, is for developing countries one of the biggest obstacles. To have information available in languages that people speak is really important. There was also an interesting debate about where some countries have trialled so-called free internet services, but either that's, you only get free to some websites, like Facebook, for example, and that they're not actually giving you free access to the internet because it's limited in that way. It's only free access to what they want to allow you to see. And also wherever there's free access, and this was talked about in cities, in cities there's lots of free access to Wi-Fi in the community, but you're really giving things up in terms of advertising, tracking, and that sort of thing. And so the goal is to give as much access to as much knowledge as possible we need to make sure these services are unbundled and not controlling. I might move to the next one, and I guess this was more about, I guess, consumer protection online, and the points being that consumer protection is struggling to keep up with the speed of change. Regulators having to be more flexible, not just use their hard tools of compliance and enforcement when businesses are operating from somewhere else in the world that they can't necessarily control. So there was lots of discussion about regulators cooperating more with other regulators across different countries. And also the role consumer advocates can play in perhaps even reporting and ranking regulators about their effectiveness in that sort of work. But regulators themselves were talking about their efforts to cooperate at an international level to address these things together. There was lots of discussion as well about the role of the World Trade Organization. So the World Trade Organization is one of the multilateral bodies that countries sign up to facilitate trade. It resolves disputes in the main, but there's a new discussions going on at that level around electronic commerce, and to have a uniform approach to, or not uniform, but a cooperative approach to electronic transactions. There isn't at the moment. The negotiations on this are just starting, but Consumers International is leading that work. Some of the things that Consumers International is arguing for at that forum is that these negotiations need to benefit consumers, not just industry, that as part of these negotiations, consumer safeguards or protections must be kept, must be safeguarded. And we need to have the ability to manage future risks as things change over time. So as AI becomes more widespread in the community, as cybersecurity becomes more of a bigger issue, these new trade rules shouldn't inhibit states from acting on these sort of issues. And of course, probably the last point there is one that I think we all know too well, is the challenges around complaints mechanisms when businesses and transactions are cross-border, and they're not participating locally in redress mechanisms. And so there was discussion about that as well. I've just got 2 more slides and then I'll hand over to Gemma. The next one was about the Internet of Things. At the conference, in fact, the Consumers International and the Internet Society, who was a key partner at the conference, released some research which really highlighted the community's concerns with the Internet of Things and some of the benefits. They found that 77% of consumers said information about privacy and security are important considerations in their buying decisions. But still only about a third of people, they say it's important, but only a third of people don't own a connected device like smart devices because they have those concerns. So again, we see that difference between what people say they're concerned about and their actual purchasing pattern. People who are buying things say that they don't trust, well, 63% of purchasers say they don't trust what they're buying, these connected devices, because they're creepy. That was the term that was used, but I thought was interesting. That I think that they're concerned about surveillance, is what they mean. This visceral sense that the thing that you're buying is not under your control. And so the things we're talking about here is it's broad. So there's toys that are now connected to the internet. They do particular things, and all the way to TVs, and we'll talk about white goods as well. And I guess the concern that some of these things are coming to market without basic security and privacy regulations. There's some dilemmas in this, I think, in terms of the policy, what to do. So manufacturers are not necessarily responding to those basic security and privacy protections because people are buying this stuff without them being there. At the same time, consumers are very price sensitive. So they want things cheap. And again, that drives manufacturers to not deliver necessarily on security and privacy protections. And so whether there's roles for regulation or, again, there was a debate about whether it can keep up, or other sorts of mechanisms like working directly with businesses, or or voluntary standards. With regulation, it was talked about that, some of these companies that build these Internet of Things devices that are sold widespread, the companies might only be in existence for 18 months and they go out of business. So again, that's an example of regulation not being quick enough. Similarly, software changes can change that are embedded in these products can change very quickly and can be deployed more quickly than you know what they are, more quickly than you know what they are. There was, I thought, some interesting discussion in this theme as well around campaigns for rights to repair, making sure that products people purchase are fixed over time, and to, for example, not allow manufacturers to stop providing software updates as they become necessary for the use of that product. That's probably been most advanced in the area of motor vehicles, where codes and software is more and more now being provided to assist repairers when they fix your car. But the proposition was that should be much more widely required of other sorts of Internet of Things products. And the last theme I thought I'd touch on before handing over to Gemma was around artificial intelligence. Again, some statistics that were shared and some research about this issue was that 76% of executives say they expected artificial intelligence to substantially transform their companies within the next 3 years. So we can see that it seems to be happening very soon. And that a third of those executives said ethical risks were one of the top 3 concerns about technology. It was recognised and talked about that many people can benefit from these new techs and can deliver more personalised and automated services, particularly people who have a disability. And there was a presenter from Google who talked about their apps about accessibility, Lookout, Live Transcribe, voice access, and that these can have benefits. But there was also talked about that these sort of services can further embed discrimination against particular groups of people. The debate really was, as these systems and products are developed, about how to make them so they're inclusive to begin with. It's always very hard to have a product or a service retrofitted after it's built to be inclusive, and that the key to building an inclusive system is through research and talking to consumers, and consumers looking for leadership from industry and regulators about these issues. And I guess, at that last point, it says there that it's debate about, again, this theme, whether we can rely on ethical codes of businesses or whether we need mandatory standards and regulation to pave the way in AI technologies. But I will hand it there and hand over to Gemma.
Great, thank you very much, Gerard. So just to introduce myself, so I'm Gemma Mitchell and I'm the Managing Solicitor at the Consumer Credit Legal Service WA, and also an executive member of Consumers Federation. And today I'm in Perth, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which I'm presenting, so that they are the Noongar people of the Whadjuk region, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any First Nations peoples who are tuning into the webinar. So Gerard's obviously given you an introduction to our 4 days in Portugal, where we got to meet consumer advocates from all over the world. And for my part of this webinar, what I'd like to do is continue on making some observations on some of the key themes that we saw coming through in the presentations. So the first theme I really want to talk about is inclusivity. As Gerard said, the topic of the conference was Digital Hive, putting consumers at the heart of digital innovation. And this topic was very much connected to the theme of this year's World Consumer Rights Day, Trusted Smart Products. So how do we put consumers at the heart of digital innovation? One of the observations was, like I've just said, in relation to inclusivity. What we heard was that consumers were often excluded from the design and decision-making process, and there were various reasons for that, and I'll go into those shortly. But by failing to include all types of consumers in the design and decision-making process, this resulted in some consumers or groups of consumers being excluded from using the end product. And where these groups of consumers were excluded from using the end product, biases and assumptions were then built into the design of the products, creating this vicious cycle. A presentation by Google said that the products, and Gerard just touched on this, they needed an early feedback mechanism because perfect products wouldn't be, they're not possible. It's not possible to make a perfect product the first time. And also using products in a lab setting is going to be very different to how they're used in real life. But really, ideally, products should be inclusive from the start because it is difficult to start making them to become inclusive after production. Okay, I'll just go to the next slide now. So the next big sort of theme around inclusivity was a focus on women. Day one of the conference started with a session titled, "What will consumer choice look like in the future digital economy?" And we were told that 70 to 80% of all consumer decisions are made by women, but that the majority of products were designed for men. And they gave the examples of things like seat belts and air conditioning. But we were told that the future is female. And the later presentation by Google also repeated these statistics and gave the example of crash test dummies only being based on men. And Google suggested that if there are opportunities to have more than one option to become inclusive, so for example, a male and a female option, then both should be used in the design process. But one of the barriers were that women are not executives on the boards of big companies, so they're not involved in the design and decision-making process from that side. And they're also massively unrepresented in Silicon Valley and do not hold many positions of power in government or regulation. So all of that needed to change at that level to become more inclusive. One of the afternoon sessions on day two was titled "Half of All Consumers," and what this session was talking about was half of all consumers being women. There were statistics that 3.9 billion people are still not online, and millions less women online than men, and women are 25% less likely than men to be online in the developing world. And there were presentations from various organizations who spoke about different projects that they're undertaking to include women. So UN Women are training women to use mobile phones. However, they found that once women got home, they had their phones taken away from them by other people in the house, and the issues therefore went far beyond just technology issues, and it was issues around social and cultural norms that drove a lot of issues with women being included. An organisation called the Girl Effect, based in the UK, partnered with Vodafone to look at how girls all over the world access the internet through mobile devices. They found there were similar results in the Philippines, Indonesia, and the USA, but in other countries, boys had 1.5 times more access to phones and girls had to borrow phones. Boys said that their access to phones was limited because of the cost, but girls said that their barriers were more social, that they felt stigmatized, unsafe, and afraid online, and unsure what to do if they were harassed. And the study concluded that the more girls were able to access the internet, the more they could learn to protect themselves. There was also a presentation by Standpoint, which is a Danish organization, who said that it wasn't intuitive for businesses to think about women during the development process, but that products are not designed with women in mind as the end consumer. And businesses needed to understand a woman's perspective and what would or wouldn't motivate them to use a product, but that also that not all women are the same. And at the final session on day two, Ashley Boyd of Mozilla left us with the thought, what would it be like if the internet was made by and for women? Which was quite an interesting proposition. Okay, on the next slide then I'm going to talk about vulnerability. So one of the groups of consumers who are often excluded from the design and end use of products are consumers experiencing vulnerability. So the first session at the conference that many of us attended was the side event co-hosted by the International Organization for Standardization and the British Standards Institute. One of the issues discussed at this event was the international standard that's currently being developed on identifying and responding to consumers in vulnerable situations. And I've linked to the standard at the bottom of the slide there. And the international standard is based on a British standard that's currently in use. So what they said at the session was that consumers experience vulnerability in a number of ways. For example, language, ability, gender, location, or financial disadvantage. And that vulnerability can be situational or temporary. For example, it could be due to bereavement or unemployment, and that all of these types of vulnerabilities can impact on a consumer's ability to make decisions and have a high potential for detriment, where consumers end up with a product or service that they don't want or need. Digital markets increase vulnerabilities because people don't have a high understanding of online marketplaces. But we did need to keep in mind that vulnerabilities are not necessarily automatically detrimental, but products should be designed with these factors, and businesses should offer support to consumers once a vulnerability is identified. So there are real opportunities for the application of international standards on consumer vulnerability to be used in the development of products. And consumers should be involved in the standards making process, as they're able to offer a valuable perspective. There are many organizations at the moment who are looking at guidelines and standards around vulnerability. For example, in Australia, we've got the recent review by the Australian Banking Association, who are currently developing a guideline on vulnerable consumers. Okay, so on the next slide, what I want to talk about are algorithms and biases and how they relate to inclusivity. So there were quite a lot of sessions at the conference which highlighted concerns with AI-enabled technologies and how they could further embed discrimination against particular groups of people, and particularly when new consumer services are rolled out without understanding local contexts. And how much free choice do we really have, or is it all determined by algorithms, which are quite unreliable and subject to large biases? Gerard mentioned the presentation by Marta Todello from Consumer Reports in the United States, and she suggested that, say, for example, when we go to do things like renewing our car insurance, that companies don't look at our driving history, but factors like where we live and our ethnicity. And this leads to not all consumers being treated equally or getting the same offers due to these types of biases. And this can also lead to those targeted ads that we all receive on social media. There are some consumers who can get real benefits from these algorithms, but they're also dangerous because of how discriminatory those biases are. The presentation by Google said that AI algorithms and data sets can reflect, reinforce, or reduce unfair biases, but that distinguishing fair from unfair biases isn't simple and can differ across cultures and societies. Standpoint, the Danish organization that I referred to previously, gave the example of languages being gender sensitive. And so all of the translations end up in gendered languages with biases. For example, Google translated engineer to male engineer and secretary to female secretary. Isabelle Durant of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development said that when she turned 60, she started getting targeted messages about retirement and homes for older people, and suggested that we needed to educate consumers to be active and call out these biases and discrimination, and that consumers have real power to do that. So the second big theme that I really wanted to talk about was around trust and leadership. And I did try to split these topics into two separate topics, but it's actually impossible. They were so interconnected during the whole conference. So I will talk about them jointly. So what we heard throughout the conference was that consumers have little trust in brands and businesses and in politicians, but that consumer advocacy groups were trusted. So there were lots of opportunities for consumer advocacy organisations to take that lead in gaining the trust of consumers. Like Jared mentioned in his part of the presentation, consumers don't understand how to operate new products and devices, and this lack of understanding leads to a lack of trust with the device. And 28% of people who don't own a connected device don't buy smart products because of concerns with privacy and security. Consumers also seek trustworthy information from other consumers, and they do this by looking at online forums, or they look to other consumers who do have expertise in that area. So that leads me on to the next focus topic, that's on online reviews. So as consumers increasingly turn to online reviews before they purchase products, there are issues with the validity of those reviews. At the side event that we attended on international standards, as well as discussing consumers experiencing vulnerability, the panel also looked at the international standard on online consumer reviews, and I've linked to that on the slide. A Which study, so the Which is the UK equivalent of Choice, found that 97% of shoppers based their purchasing decisions on online reviews. But the study found that many of the reviews were fraudulent, and the report referred to an unknown headphone brand receiving 400 5-star Amazon reviews in a single day. The international standard aims to provide a mechanism where reviews are moderated before they're posted and are taken down if they are suspected to be fraudulent. It is only a voluntary standard, so not all online reviews sites need to comply, but if they do, then that should be listed on the website, and that will give the consumer trust in those reviews. The next focus area was around the regulators, and where consumers lack trust in brands and businesses, this presented an opportunity for regulators to take the lead to restore consumer trust in brands by taking action for breaches to the law. Lucas Davila from CERNAC in Chile spoke about a class action in Chile by the regulator against Citibank for a leak of customer information, and they were able to reach a settlement for over 50,000 consumers and therefore gain the trust of the community by taking this action. And we also heard that earlier this year, the European Commission had fined Google 1.49 billion euros for breaching EU anti-competition rules. Google, in that case, had used its market dominance to impose a number of restricted clauses in contracts with third-party websites, and this prevented Google's rivals from placing their search adverts on those websites. However, not everyone agreed with that proposition, and Taylor Bentley from the Government of Canada believed that class actions didn't restore confidence for consumers, and he thought class actions were quite aggressive and it wasn't empowering for consumers to know that they could seek compensation for redress. What consumer wanted was not to have to be in that situation in the first place where they were having to seek redress. The next focus was on consumer organisations, and one of the key themes was that there was a real opportunity, and Jared has touched on this as well, for consumer organisations and consumer advocacy groups to lead the way in gaining consumers' trust. And it was suggested that we even have a responsibility to take on that role. In relation to the use of devices, that there are plenty of opportunities for education and to link up new users of technology with experts. We heard that by 2020, Generation Z consumers will be the largest consumer market. And as they've grown up in a digital world, there were opportunities for them to show leadership to new users. Fundamentally Children is an organisation based in the UK, and they attended the conference. They recently produced a paper after the conference titled Connected Grandparents: Are Smart Toys the Future for Intergenerational Play? And this study explored the benefits to the older and younger generation in having this interaction. And I've linked to this study on the slide. And there's an opportunity here for consumer organisations to take on the role to make those intergenerational connections. In relation to trust in brands, there's opportunities for us to take the lead in research. For example, Consumer International recently released a research paper on social media scams, and it's the first research of its kind. What Consumers International did was undertook a study that monitored public online conversations about social media scams in 9 countries over 2 years. And Consumers International found that many social media scams are cross-border problems for consumers and often originate from another country where the same language is spoken. And they found that consumer protection authorities and consumer organizations both agreed that social media platforms should work with stakeholders and take more decisive action to tackle fraudulent, harmful or illegal content on their platforms that can spread across borders. And I've also linked to the research paper on the slide. And finally, consumer groups need to convey the challenges facing consumers to businesses to help them deliver what consumers want. What we can do as consumer advocacy organisations is show businesses how to meet consumer expectations. Businesses should build better trusted relationships with their consumers by providing good and better customer service, and at the dispute resolution stage to provide improved complaints handling and redress schemes. And if they fail to do this, then it's up to us as consumer organisations to hold them to account. So now I'll hand you back over to Gerard, who talks some more.
Thanks, Gemma. I'll just touch on a couple of, I've pulled out some focus topics. These were both from the conference itself, but also the day after the conference was a day for members of CI to talk about issues that perhaps weren't covered through the conference. But building on what Gemma has just discussed about scams, that was a key area of discussion. Given so much money is lost by people every day to scams, and Consumers International has it as a priority to work with major players like social media, like e-commerce and payments platforms, with the shared goal of preventing scams. They talked about there being potentially untapped potential in working better or putting more accountability around payment intermediaries, including banks. So the major rule in most countries is that payments should not be taken from someone's account unless it's authorised. However, we probably haven't taken that as far as it couldn't go. So the example was subscription traps. So businesses these days are encouraging you to sign up to a month free of something, insert your credit card details here, and then don't necessarily make it as clear as they could that after a month they'll start charging your credit card. And it was put that it's not enough to say that a credit card details are entered in at the beginning of the transaction, that in fact it should be authorised when money is taken out. And if not, then that should give the consumer redress. So I thought that was interesting on subscription traps. Another example was this company called, not-for-profit actually, called scamadvisor.com. It's in effect a trustworthiness mark for websites. It examines hundreds of thousands of websites and looks at technical aspects of the website, looks at third-party reviews, looks at histories with that particular website and its server, and then makes a trustworthy mark for that website. and you can kind of go to that scamadvisor.com and type in our website URL, and it'll tell you how trustworthy it is before you use it. They've also got a widget that they make available to any consumer organisation to put on their own website, so that people can use that service as well. And in fact, that organisation has been in touch with the Consumers Federation asking that we consider putting that on our website. That's something we'll look into. One of the points of discussion was about that there's not necessarily a clear line between outright fraud and scams and legitimate business activity that results in losses. And I think that those subscription traps might be one example of that. But there was, on the back of that, there was a discussion about the work that regulators can and are doing with social media platforms in particular, using what's called takedown procedures, entering into agreement and then requiring platforms to take down suspicious information, and going further than that. The argument was that it shouldn't just be in response to what regulators are doing, but social medias themselves should be using algorithms to improve and knowing what's on their platforms and taking things down when it's potentially a scam. One of the more interesting regulatory arguments I heard at the conference related to scams, and again, it links back to the unfair directive practices in the EU laws. And they said that unfair directive practices includes a requirement of professional diligence on business owners and service providers. And they said when you can use that to say that actually intermediaries and platforms are required to have good standards to prevent nefarious things happens on their platforms by third parties. So I thought that was an interesting approach. There was, I went along to a discussion around financial services. There was sort of a bit of a debate here around the extent that financial education is important and regulation is important. I think that the difference of perspectives was really one of sophistication of regulatory regimes, and in countries where it was difficult to progress a more sophisticated regulatory regime, consumer organisations had reverted to relying on financial education. But I think all agreed that that wasn't sufficient, and that responsible lending is integral in the law, but also by action on predatory practices by regulators. There was lots of discussion, in fact, in this session about the harms of payday lending, and I've got a couple of the countries listed there where there were keen campaigns on payday lending, which I'm personally connecting in with now to find out more about what they're doing in those countries. The research showed that I think it was Lithuania that up to a third of people were using payday loans, which was quite astonishing. One of the more interesting advocacy strategies I heard around payday lending came from the representative from Russia. And in the last 12 months, Russia has actually enacted an interest and fee cap for the first time on payday lending. It's not as low as probably what the consumer advocates was preferred. I think it's around 100%, but it's a lot lower than the 600 to 800% that was being charged previously. And the consumer advocate from Russia told me quite proudly that in discussions with his government and even the president, he used the anecdotes from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, making the point that in that book, the moneylender was charging 5 times the interest rate cap that exists now in Russia, and the penalty was death. And he was quite proud because Putin himself actually used that anecdote when announcing the law reform. So I found that quite fascinating. The next one, the last one really I'll touch on is collective redress, which again, picking up on some of the things that Gemma talked about, was an area of topic at the conference. And it was recognised that this is really one of the most powerful tools in consumer protection. And there was lots of interesting examples of collective redress, either class actions happening in different countries. So, example in India, where there is actually well developed to find individual redress arrangements, and although there is collective redress in the law, it's not well used. But there was an example of a case where fake products were sold on Amazon, a fake eye cosmetic product that caused injury. A product batch affected a large number of people, so it was a product safety issue. And they took a class action which resulted in Amazon having to notify all buyers of that product and enable them to make a complaint to the vendor and render a public apology. So I thought that was interesting. There was also another example from India around scooter hire costs, sort of an unfair charge that was applied to this non-disclosed charge that again also resulted in a change of practices and refunds. In Chile, there was a case against Apple for slowing down, the argument being, I think we've heard this in Australia as well, that Apple intentionally allowing software updates to slow the phone down when new models were released. So the argument was it's defective phones. The court has now declared that admissible and it is progressing. So I don't think it's finalised yet. And in Europe, it was probably recognised that that's probably one of the areas where Europe law, what's sometimes put up as the best in consumer protection, but it's probably less well developed in collective redress. And so there was a lot of campaigning going on for a new collective redress instrument across all European countries. While consumer protection law is harmonised through Europe, enforcement relies on each particular state. So that the enforcement isn't Europe harmonised. There is now a proposal at the EU level for a representative action, but at the moment it's only going to allow injunctions. It's not going to allow money being returned. And there was also discussion about how this inconsistency between jurisdictions creates unfairness between different types of different consumers wherever they live. And the example being the Volkswagen emissions scandal, where in some countries people have been able to get redress and refunds, and in other countries they haven't, against the same business with the same conduct. So the example was that in the US, after 9 months after that scandal, purchasers got between $10,000 and $20,000 refunds plus repair. Plus there was a $1 billion euro fine, whereas in Europe there was only sort of a €5 million fine and no redress for individuals. The other interesting thing in this area was particularly the role of consumer organisations in collective redress. Unlike Australia, where we've got private class action law firms that really take the lead in these areas, it seemed to me that in most of the other countries, it was the consumer organisations themselves leading this sort of litigation. And that may be due to restrictions and private firms doing this sort of work. But I thought that was a very interesting to compare us to them. But I will pass back to Gemma to talk about our CFA side event.
Thank you very much, Gerard. So yeah, this is my last slide and last bit of the presentation, and we really couldn't talk about the summit without referring to our own presentation that was delivered by Ian Jarrett. And I see Ian's logged into this webinar, so hopefully I can do it justice and paraphrase him correctly. Some of the issues that I found really interesting were around the many benefits to consumers in having unit pricing, but actually that many consumer groups in attendance didn't have unit pricing in their country. And that Ian was instrumental in implementing unit pricing within Australia and also in the development of the international standard. There were some issues though with countries that had it implemented, and that Australia is included in that. And those issues were around consistency For example, there were different units that were being used for comparison purposes. So you might go into a supermarket and see something measured per 100 grams compared to something per kilo. Also, labels were placed either really high on shelves or really low, and that was restricting mobility access to be able to have a look at those prices, to be able to compare them. And I think we've probably all seen that in our local supermarkets. There is currently a review underway in Australia with opportunities expected for improvement. And so hopefully those types of issues will be ironed out in that review. And then also it's looking to expand unit pricing to other products and services and stores that don't have unit pricing at the moment. And that might appear now in hardware stores and in pharmacies, because there's currently no unit pricing there. That's my summary of Ian's session.
Thanks, Gemma. And I just thought my final slide, just to let people know about the Consumers International General Assembly, which is part of the governance framework to bring all the members together to have an annual meeting and also accept the reports from the board of the organisation or the council and elections. It was quite fascinating because CFA is a voting member of Consumers International, and I was the lucky delegate to vote on behalf of CFA. So I actually got lobbied a bit about who to vote for. There were various representatives asking me to vote for them, telling me a bit about which country they represent and why they should be on the Consumers International board, and emails and even videos in some instances. So it was very interesting. Alan Kirkland has been from Choice, has been on the CI council and board, and he is again successful. And in fact, he got the most votes out of any representative. So Australia is very popular at the international level. The new president was also appointed of Consumers International, and that is Marimuthu Nadasan from Malaysia. I thought it was really great to see someone from our region being appointed to that role, and the other countries that were successful are listed there. And finally, I just thought I should say the other thing that was people might find of interest is the Consumers International has a new Director General who only just started about 8 weeks before the event. She effectively the CEO of the organisation, if you like. So she was new to the consumer movement, but had a long history with observing the consumer movement. She'd been involved in international fora. Her name is Helena Laurent, and I was very impressed with her at the conference. I think she'll be a good leader at Consumers International. But that's all I had. I don't know if there's any questions that have come up, Georgia.
Unfortunately, my computer's
it died. I'll just check in here.
I think you said more of the chat.
Oh, there is some chat questions.
That might have just been me helping Robin join.
Oh, yeah, that's all there. Well, if there's no questions or nothing else coming up here, we might say thank you very much for joining our webinar. And of course, Gemma and I would be happy to follow up on any further questions people have out of this. And we look forward to seeing you at future CFA webinars. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.